let's unpack what solar punk is at its roots. How does it compare with cyberpunk's gritty dystopian future that Hollywood blockbusters often show us?
Yes, and I will also talk about how they are the same. I think we should just quickly take a step back and draw on Mark Fisher's work, where he talks about capitalist realism and how in the early 2010s, I mean, his famous phrase is that it doesn't feel like the future has started yet, and that the capitalist realism is also the feeling. It's where his phrase about like it's easier to imagine the end of the world rather than the end of capitalism comes from. It's the same book. There is a sense even today that Western culture, I'm going to say, like mass-produced Western culture is stuck, and that we have run out of future, as it were. If you think about the different futures that were presented in culture that we had, is that after the post-war we have kind of the atomic future, where energy will be limitless, kind of the Jetsons future, right?
Yes.
And then we move through into the 1960s, where we start to get the first apocalyptic movies, as well as we get 2001, science progress, the narrative there. Through the 1970s, what happens is that we start to move into franchise futures, which is like Star Wars, obviously in 1977. And then in the 80s, we start to get all the disaster, the beginnings of the disaster movies, a continuation of Star Trek, which is actually from the 60s. And then in the 90s, we get even more disaster movies, most of which, the really big ones are natural disasters, whether it's a asteroid is coming or the seas are rising and there's the big flood that's going to flood New York. Do you remember all of those films that came out? And then in the 2000s, which is the era that Mark Fisher is sort of beginning to referring to in his book, you start to have media itself starts to operate under the logic of capital, where we start to think of media and visions of the future, or just media in general, as a commodity. And now we find ourselves in 2024 with 100 remakes happening, in excess of 100 remakes happening. The biggest movie franchise currently is the Marvel movies, which are all based on children's characters from the 1950s. All of the films that we seem to be getting, like Mad Max, for example, and Fury Road, are reboots of films from the 1970s. And the reason being, and this is what I call this cultural fracking. And what's happening is that because we're treating culture and media as a commodity, the people who own it have to go back to a period when everyone shared these ideas of media, which is before the internet, because our experience of we don't have any of these shared cultural grammars anymore. And what's happened is the future disintegrates, and the future is owned and continues to be owned by people who are recycling the futures from previous decades.
Right.
So we're stuck in this steady state cultural imagination, and that's what solarpunk, as a response to Mark Fisher's work, kind of tries to do. It tries to imagine our way into a new future, or perhaps give permission to people to think beyond this steady state imagination and imagine a future that they would like to live in, rather than a future that is kind of being imposed upon them via some other means. For me, solarpunk has always been an invitation to think about the future themselves. And this is where cyberpunk comes in contrast, because Frederick Jameson says that sci-fi is all about the present, or it's a response to the present rather than explicitly thinking about the future.
Right.
So cyberpunk is a response to the anxieties and the present of the 1980s, which is the rise of ubiquitous computing, the beginnings of global warming, but you also have the tail end of the Cold War. So you have anxieties around nuclear annihilation, the rise of zero tolerance policing in the US, so on and so forth. Anxieties around healthcare as well. So all of these things go into their response to the present and in order to imagine the future.
I'm going to confess something, which is my all-time favorite movie. Is Blade Runner.
Right.
You know, I've seen it, I don't know how many times. I absolutely love it. I just love it. And now as I began to read about solar punk, I'm beginning to realize that there is an allure to dystopia, and it's kind of becomes a cautionary tale of where we are and how fragile we are. But there is also this kind of idea of dystopic beauty, right? And everyone tells me I absolutely have to watch Black Panther. Because that is that has solar punk sensibilities.
And it's interesting that you say about Blade Runner, which takes the cyberpunk aesthetic, but is based on the book Android's Dream, which is a response to both nuclear annihilation and like the replacement of workers by machines, which is where the Android theme comes from. You know, so there's kind of like two layers of response to the present in that film. So solar punk, when it hit me, those words, the combination of words, just fills me with the idea of possibility about kinds of futures that we could imagine today or 10 years ago, given that we knew the falling cost of solar, the experience curve was dropping. And in the same way that cyberpunk, I suppose, is a response to one semiconductor technology, which is the microchip, then solar punk is a response to another semiconductor technology, which is the solar PV cell.
Right.
You know, and so given all of these things together, solar punk becomes, or it continues to be, an invitation for individuals to think about the future, one that they would like to live in rather than one that we should be avoiding.